Is the streaming on?
One moment.
Yeah, I see you. Perfect.
Yep, we're good.
Yeah, I see it on YouTube, so no problem. Perfect. Shall we start? Shall we kick it off? Perfect. Very well. Greetings and salutations. I'm very, very happy to be here with you all today, together with my friend and co-host Greg Moss, for this new session of our seminar cycle, Being Singular, Historical and Theoretical Perspectives. My name is Alessandro De Cesaris, and today we are going to listen a talk by my co-host, so the other organizer of this seminar cycle, Gregory Scott Moss from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And this has been a very beautiful and productive year so far. So we have met in Hong Kong. We are going to meet again in Turin. We are going to do lots of things. And as you know, we already did the seminar cycle a year ago, and we are going for the second cycle for the second year in 2025. At the end of this year, we are going to start working on a collected volume, and that's also why Greg and I will give talks in this cycle. So I will not present Greg because I believe you all know him very, very well. He's professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's written a beautiful book on Hegel and singularity, so Hegel's Foundation-Free Metaphysics. And he's working on another book that is upcoming, and I think he will tell us something about this new book where Hegel meets Schelling and not only. So I can't wait. The title of his presentation is The Singularity of Existence. And I'd say, Greg, I thank you for being here today, but mostly for organizing this with me. So this is being so much fun and so important for me. So thank you, and I leave you the floor.
Thank you so much, Alex, for the kind introduction. And I know a lot of you already, so it's good to see some friends, old teachers and colleagues here today. So yeah, I'm happy to share with you a draft of part of my forthcoming book, tentatively titled Absolute Dialetheism, but it's still in the works. The book is very long. It turned out to be 800 pages, and so I have, by accident, wrote two books, and so the publisher might be publishing them separately. And what I'm going to present to you today is a kind of programmatic outline of half of part one. So many of the concepts in the book I will not discuss. Problem of the missing difference, the concept of the transconsistent theory of truth, the question of the origin of empirical kinds. There's a lot of content and ideas that I won't have time for, but I wanted to give you a sense of the method of thinking and the spirit of the book. And because it's not published yet, if you have any comments, critiques, etc., I'm still accepting them. There's still time. So please don't hesitate, either in the question and answer period today or by email or by other personal correspondence. So I'm going to share my paper so that you can read along with me. Hope you can see this. Okay. 1 second. Sorry, let me get myself. All right. So sorry for the delay. There we go. All right, here we go. All right, so the talk is about 1 hour. Okay, 1 hour and 5 minutes. The task of
Greg, maybe sorry, before you start, maybe you can make it slightly bigger. Would it be a problem?
Oh yes, I can. No problem. Like this? Is that
Yeah,
okay?
that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. The task of philosophy, as Fichte so eloquently articulated it in his 1804 Science of Knowing, consists in the presentation of the absolute. Fichte's manifesto about the task of philosophy is not unique to him alone. To the contrary, from its earliest beginnings, Western philosophy has concerned itself with everything. Thales famously proclaimed that everything is water. It may seem that today we are very far from Thales. However, are we so far from him today? Prima facie, contemporary naturalism appears to be more sophisticated than Thales' view, but this sophistication is all but illusory. In order to know that it is true that everything is water, one must conceive everything as water. But what is a concept? The concept of water is not itself water. Thus, not everything is water. Thales' view cannot account for the existence of his knowledge that everything is water. One does not improve Thales' position by replacing water with a more scientifically informed position, such as everything is subatomic particles. Contemporary forms of naive ontological naturalism make the same mistake. Naive naturalism treats empirical concepts as absolute. Empirical concepts are not absolute concepts, for they do not apply to themselves. The concept of $100 is not itself $100. The concept of water does not itself have the properties of water. It is not self-referential. It is not an instance of itself. Since the absolute is complete and empirical concepts are always incomplete, empirical concepts are never sufficient for grasping the totality. In order to know the absolute, we cannot rely upon empirical concepts alone. Without accounting for the existence of our very knowing of the world, our account of the world remains incomplete. Empirical concepts have their origin in experience. More precisely, they have their origin in perceptual experience. We know about water and even subatomic particles by means of perceptual experience. Because empirical concepts are derived from experience, the incompleteness of the empirical concept ought to be discernible in perceptual experience itself. The incompleteness of empirical concepts has its origin in the incompleteness of perceptual experience. As Wittgenstein noted, the visual perception does not see the eye. But you do not really see the eye, and from nothing in the field of sight can it be concluded that it is seen from an eye. Visual perception does not see its own act of perceiving. Indeed, it is only because it is blind to itself that it can see anything else. To be sure, perceptual experience is a process whereby entities are made manifest. However, it never provides a complete experience, for it never perceives itself. Thus, there should be no surprise that empirical thinking is incomplete, for its origin, perceptual experience, is fundamentally incomplete too. What is more, given the horizonality of experience, no perceptual experience includes all possible objects of perception. Every perceptual experience of an object is made possible by a horizon that enables some objects to appear only by excluding other possible objects of experience. If conceiving is modeled on perceiving, it is no surprise that our conceptual capacities can never grasp totality. For just as the whole cannot be present for perception, neither can it be present for thought. Empirical concepts are not the only concepts devoid of self-reference. Mathematical concepts are just as devoid of self-reference as the empirical ones. By recursive applications of the successor function, one can build an ordinal series. As is obvious, the successor function is not itself one of the ordinal numbers. Just as the successor function does not apply to itself, neither does the concept of number in general. Number itself is not a number. Since the absolute is complete and mathematical concepts are incomplete, we cannot rely upon mathematical concepts alone for absolute knowledge. This consequence is made clear by Badiou's being an event. According to Badiou, sense by Russell's paradox, the set of all sets that are not members of themselves is inherently contradictory, and the set of all sets that are not members of themselves is the absolute, or what Badiou calls the one. The absolute is inherently contradictory. With Gabriel and against Cantor, Badiou declares that what set theory enacts on the contrary under the effect of the paradoxes is that the one is not. Hence our problem: how can we achieve absolute knowledge? What is the method by which the absolute can be known? What is the structure of the concept, if there is one, by which the absolute can be known? Purification and dialectics. How can philosophy present the world in concepts? No concept that has its origin in perceptual experience is sufficient. Likewise, mathematical knowledge is not sufficient for absolute knowing. And since perception and its attendant incompleteness is a stumbling block to absolute knowledge, in order to know the absolute, one ought to completely detach from perceptual experience in mathematical thinking. Plato's Phaedo offers a masterclass in philosophical method, in which philosophical method requires an absolute detachment from perceptual experience. In the Phaedo, Plato calls upon the philosopher to practice for dying and being dead. Only by detaching from the body and the faculties by which bodies are perceived, namely the sense, can absolute knowledge be achieved. The imagination, too, depends on perceptual experience for its content. Thus, one should not ignore Meister Eckhart's call to embrace a radical Abgeschiedenheit from all images, for only there can one achieve knowledge of God, the Hen Kai Pan. Following Plato, we hold that the pure is only revealed to the pure. Philosophical purification testifies to the freedom of philosophy. One of the great achievements of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is that it shows that any attempt to relativize conceptual knowing only absolutizes it. By limiting conceptual knowing to representations of a knowing subject and opposing it to an object that transcends it, the object is conceived as something non-conceptual. However, the claim that the object is independent of conceptual knowing renders it conceptual. Every conception of the independent object as non-conceptual is only a further conceptualization of the object. Thus, the knowing subject learns that the concept is all-encompassing. It is instantiated both in the subject and the object of its knowing. In the final analysis, this cannot be an indirect knowing, for there is nothing that transcends the field of conceptual mediation. The conceptual knowledge that conceptual form has no limits demands direct self-knowledge. The philosopher can only draw such a limit to the concept by exceeding that limit, and once one has taken up the task of knowing the world by means of concepts, nothing can appear except through the mediation of conceptual determination. By purifying conceptual thought from all non-conceptual foundations, conceptual thinking no longer depends upon something other than itself for its justification, but can only rely upon itself. And since freedom is something other than self-determination, purifying philosophy of all non-conceptual foundations engenders the absolute freedom of conceptual thought. Part 3, the meaning of existence. In order to know whether the absolute exists, one ought to first inquire into the meaning of existence per se. Nothing can exist unless it instantiates a universal. If someone denies that what exists must instantiate a universal, one ought to be able to give a counterexample. However, this would be impossible. If I discover a counterexample to the principle that what exists must instantiate a universal, then something would exist that does not instantiate one. However, the counterexample still instantiates a universal, the universal being, but the counterexample has some being. It is not nothing. What is more, the counterexample will be further distinguished from everything that does instantiate universals. As such, the counterexample will also instantiate the concept of negation, by which it would be distinct from beings that do instantiate universals. If we know that some concept is instantiated in some particular, we know that this particular in some way exists. One might worry that this argument begs the question. The interlocutor can only answer with words, they cannot speak without employing concepts. But the lesson is this: it is at least the case that one cannot philosophize without acknowledging the conceptual form of existence, for every denial of its conceptuality only conceptualizes it again. The instantiation relation that is constitutive of particularity does not refer to the particular alone, for instantiation is the particularization of the universal. As a result, every particular depends upon the existence of universals. As Aristotle taught us in Book Beta of his Metaphysics, if there were only particulars and no universals, then there could not even be particulars, for particulars instantiate the universal particularity. On the one hand, in order to exist, the particulars must be conceptually determined, and this is impossible without universals. On the other hand, since nothing exists that does not instantiate a universal, if there were only universals and no particulars, then the universals would not exist, for all universals are particulars that instantiate the concept of universality itself. Thus, existence is never merely universal nor particular, but whatever exists is always already both. Because singularity or Einzelheit expresses the unity of the universal and the particular, everything that exists is singular. Existence is singularity. So now we're on to the topic of the seminar. Since universals too only exist if they instantiate a universal, every particular depends upon the existence of universals that are also particulars. Because singularity expresses the unity of the universal and the particular, no universal exists unless it also is singular. And since no particular exists without the existence of the universal, everything that exists depends upon the singularity of universals. In every case, to exist is to be singular. Exactly because nothing exists that does not instantiate a universal, philosophy is able to know what exists by means of conceptual thought. If truth is the correspondence of the concept with being, then truth is obtained when the concept matches the being. Were existence totally transconceptual, then no philosophical concept could in principle correspond to what exists, and philosophy would fail to match its concepts with beings. Thus, if what exists were not conceptual, philosophy would fail to possess true concepts about what exists. In order to truly conceive existence, the concept must already in principle be unified with what exists. For instance, the judgment Socrates is human can only be true if the concept of humanity is actually realized in Socrates himself. And because existence has the form of singularity, the form of the judgment, the particular is universal, expresses the true form of existence in thought. Philosophy begins in medias res, and only because it begins in the middle of things can it undergo any such act of conceptual purification. The experience of philosophical purification, the experience of withdrawal, is itself sufficient to know that something exists. And having recognized that something exists, and whatever exists must instantiate some universal, what exists is inherently structured. It is not purely transconceptual and indeterminate. Or in the language of the ancients, nothing exists without form. Whatever exists appears to us in an ordered way, and this order is conceptual in kind. If to exist means to instantiate a universal, we can ask whether there are any absolute universals. The class of beings consists in those entities that instantiate the concept of being. And we know this class is not empty. Does the complete and organized totality of beings exist? Does the world itself exist? Here I contend that one cannot give a reason against the existence of the world without reinstating it. The opponents of the world whom I am engaging, Gabriel and Badiou, question the world without questioning the validity of philosophy to make this claim. The position that the world, the absolute, does not exist is demonstrably false. To exist is to instantiate a concept. Consider the class of beings as that class which instantiates the concept of being. The class of beings would be incomplete if there were some being that did not belong to the class. And if the class is necessarily incomplete, then the world cannot exist. But if this were true, then there would be some being that existed outside the class of beings. But in this case, this being would no longer be outside the class, for it is a being and would thereby belong to it. Thus, it is impossible to find anything that would render the class of beings incomplete, or what is the same, there is nothing outside the class of beings, for whatever is outside is also inside, such that the totality of beings exists. If anything exists at all, the class of existence is complete. But the complete class of beings is nothing but the world, the totality from which nothing is absent. Again, if one denies the existence of the world, one must deny that there is a universal that applies to everything. But this is an impossible position, for everything instantiates the concept of being, among others. In sum, the world is nothing other than the organized totality that instantiates the concept of being, among others. Having purified oneself of all relative knowing, mathematical and empirical knowing, one can finally resolve to think absolute being. Dialectics is the philosophical method by which the absolute, or the world, is known. If the absolute is the end of philosophical knowledge, dialectics is the means. In order to know the world, dialectical thinking employs concepts that apply to everything, including itself. Having liberated oneself from everything relative incomplete, what remains? All that remains is to think what is left, the absolute, what is relative to nothing. By divorcing one's thought from all relative existence, abstraction reveals a concept of absolute existence, existence without further qualification. By withdrawing from everything relative, philosophy purifies itself of what is relative and thinks the concept of absolute existence, sein, reines Sein. The concept of being is the unity of all beings, insofar as it expresses that in virtue of which each being is a member of the totality of everything that exists. With the question, what is being, the questioner investigates the predicate that would distinguish being, what it is that would set being apart from beings. To answer the question, we must declare that being is such and such. Being does not differentiate between any beings. To proclaim that a being is does not differentiate it from any other being that is. Being does not introduce any differentiation into the field of being. Being is indistinct. As Schelling teaches us, the being of being is complete Gleichgültigkeit. Dialectics is a form of conceptual thinking in which one conceives everything by means of self-referential concepts. Badiou, for example, who claims that the one is not, fails to think the world because he primarily operates with and thinks from concepts structured like those endemic to empirical sciences and mathematics, concepts lacking self-referential predication. In order to be absolute, the concept must apply to itself, otherwise it would be a merely relative notion. And since being is an absolute concept, it must be self-referential. Being itself has being, and for this reason, it must be an instance of itself. Being is a being. When we ask what is being, we are really asking what is the being of being. The question itself cannot be asked without self-referential predication. Meta and object language collapse into one. Every philosophical position in which meta and object language are absolutely distinct relativizes the philosophical language and undermines its capacity to range over everything. Being is a being. The concept of undifferentiated being immediately negates itself. Each being is a being, this or that being, each is a particular being distinct from and relative to others. And because all other beings are only individual because they are differentiated, the concept of indistinction specifies the way that being is different from other beings. The concept of absolute indistinction differentiates being from relative differentiated things. As a result, being is one differentiated being among others, since it is different from all differentiated beings in virtue of its indistinct character. The self-referential character of being engenders existential implication. Because the concept of being is absolute, the concept applies to itself, and since it applies to itself, being falls within its own class. It must instantiate being. And as an instance of being, being is a particular being, this being. Ontotheology is simply true. The concept of being exists in virtue of itself, and dialectics teaches us that absolute concepts are existentially implicative. Absolute concepts are not merely possibilities to be, they are self-realizing possibilities. Since to exist is to instantiate a universal and being is an instance of itself, it follows that being exists. And because it is an absolute concept, it must be self-predicative and exist in virtue of itself. Being is singular, for it is both universal and particular, but it has its particularity in virtue of itself, not in virtue of something else. And since it is particular in virtue of itself and singularity depends upon particularity, being is self-singularizing. Being must exist. It exists in virtue of itself. It is cognition infused with will, the absolute idea. In sum, the world is the organized totality of beings, the absolute unity in which everything exists. Further, the world is not just a sum, for it is unified by absolute concepts, one of which is the concept of being. Absolute concepts are self-predicative, existentially implicative, and self-realizing possibilities. Being is also the totality of all beings, or the world itself. Since the distinguishing feature of being is its indistinctness, and since we can quantify overall beings, being itself cannot be distinct from any being. Because it is indistinct, it cannot be distinct from any being. Thus, being cannot be distinct from any differentiated being. Being is the self-differentiating absolute, that which negates itself as a separate indistinct being and presents itself as indistinct from the domain of differentiated beings. Because being is indistinct from every being, being has no limit and must be infinite. Being is the absolutely unlimited totality. The unlimited totality is not relative to anything else, for everything falls within it. Thus, in this way too, being is the absolute, for it is just as much the totality as the whole itself. As indistinct, being expresses itself in all particular beings, such that the world cannot be differentiated from the concept upon which it depends. The world is being insofar as it has differentiated itself. It is the Henkaipan, the one and only, the free and singular absolute. The term absolute captures both the conceptual aspect of the Henkaipan and its status as a being. First, absolute is a predicate which applies to concepts. Being is absolute. We nominalize the predicate because the absolute is not just a property of a concept, but exists as one being among many and is coextensive with the world whole. To conclude, the absolute is the unconditioned universal that all beings have in common, one particular being among many, and the singular totality of beings, the world. The absolute is everything, the one and all. Given the old definition of God as pure being, our philosophical adventure in absolute thinking brings us to the threshold of the Neoplatonic insight that because God is beyond all relative things, God is all things. In Eckhart's words, therefore God is free of all things, and therefore he is all things. Cusanus too would echo the Meister. God is all things, in all things, and yet remains absolute from them all. The Neoplatonic tradition, irrespective of its pagan, Christian form or otherwise, endorses a common ontological formula. God transcends all beings and is all beings. In theological terms, this position appears to engender a commitment to panentheism, according to which the absolute is a being that is all things and transcends all things. Okay, part 4, the ontological argument. The existence of the absolute is established by means of existentially implicative concepts, and such concepts exist in virtue of themselves alone. Since the ontological argument is a form of proof whereby the concept alone is sufficient to infer the existence of the concept, one might object that the dialectical argument for the existence of the absolute depends upon the ontological argument. Indeed, this is exactly right, for without concepts that imply their own existence, the very existence of the world would be impossible. The proof from the concept is the natural consequence of the purification of thought. Kant famously objects that existence is not a predicate, but is this true? Is existence a predicate? It's quite hard to deny that it is. If I ask what is it to exist and one answers to instantiate a concept or singularity, then the answer has predicative form. If to exist means to particularize a universal, then existence is a predicate, for it can be said of many universals. This universal is instantiated and that universal is instantiated. But if to exist is to be particularized and particulars are not universals, existence is not a predicate, for predicates are universals. Indeed, whatever exists is not a predicate, for it is a particular. Thus, existence itself is singular. It's both universal and particular. As Hegel points out in his Science of Logic, Kant's argument against the ontological argument equivocates on absolute and empirical concepts. One cannot evaluate the truth conditions of absolute and self-referential concepts by the truth conditions of merely relative and empirical ones. The critique of the ontological argument measures the existence of an absolute concept, that is, the absolute, by appealing to truth conditions of empirical concepts like $100. By observing that by measuring absolute concepts by the structure of relative concepts, Kant unknowingly equivocates on different forms of universality. From Thales to Kant, philosophers always and again make a similar mistake. We model our concept of the absolute on relativity. Descartes was right from the beginning. We cannot think of God as not existing. Either we're thinking of God existing or we're not thinking about God at all. Atheism is a totally impossible position. As Hegel says, the concept of God realizes itself most fully as this universal that determines and particularizes itself. This is the concept as such, the concept of God, close quote. The critiques of the ontological argument from Aquinas to Schelling usually reformulate the proof as a hypothetical. If God exists, then God is that being whose essence is to exist. The hypothetical reformulation is tantamount to the denial of the existence of absolute concepts. Are all concepts merely relative to existence conditions that transcend them? If nothing exists that does not instantiate a universal, this cannot be true, for nothing exceeds the form of the concept. And if the form of the concept is coextensive with being, the form of universality and the concept of being are absolute, for they apply to everything that exists. Thus, there are absolute concepts whose existence conditions cannot exceed them, since nothing at all exceeds them. In short, one cannot absolutize the distinction between concept and existence without compromising the singular and conceptual form of the world itself, a form that ensures the possibility of philosophical knowledge of the world. No ontological argument, no rationalism. To quote Spinoza, whatsoever is in God, and nothing can exist or be conceived without God. Recently, Robert Pippin has declared that Heidegger is right, there is no absolute, there cannot be an absolute. But Pippin, who never acknowledged the central role of the ontological argument in Hegel's thought, is absolutely wrong. There is the absolute, there must be an absolute. Even Heidegger teaches us that only being is. Against all Kantian or positivist protestations, German idealism teaches us that the absolute must appear. Indeed, some form of the most iconic texts of the German idealist tradition, from Schelling's system of transcendental idealism to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, attempt to fulfill Fichte's call to present the absolute. The question is not whether the absolute appears, but how it appears. Section 5, absolute dialetheism. The absolute is contradictory. Nancy is right that a singular being is a contradiction in terms. And this insight applies just as well to the singularity of the absolute. Since being is absolutely undifferentiated, being must be different from all differentiated beings. And for this reason, being must be indistinct from everything else and distinct from everything else. Absolute indistinctness does not permit any difference in being, but being is distinct from all other beings. Further, being is differentiated in virtue of its indistinct being. Put otherwise, exactly because being is undifferentiated, it is not different from all differentiated being. Dialectics can achieve absolute knowledge by employing self-referential concepts that are existentially implicative, but as Kant taught us, absolute knowledge comes at a high cost, consistency. Dialectical knowledge is inherently contradictory. To see this point more clearly, consider the concept of the absolute itself. Everything that is relative exists in relation to something that transcends it, and everything that is relative excludes something. And since the absolute excludes nothing, the absolute cannot be relative. But on the other hand, if the absolute were simply other than what is relative, then it would not be absolute. If the absolute were other to what is relative, then it would exclude something and would not itself be relative. Hence, in order to be absolute, the absolute itself must be relative. The singularity of the absolute is a contradictory singularity. There are three ways of thinking about the contradiction. There are others too. For universals that are particulars of another universal, the universal can be universal and particular in different respects. For instance, the concept of the mammal is universal, for it is instantiated in many kinds of mammalia, but it is a particular because it instantiates a different concept, such as the concept of life, among other concepts. But for absolute concepts, it is universal and particular in the same respect, for it is particular in virtue of its very universality. Following Nishida's logic of contradictory identity, we can identify discrete and interconnected principles of one dialectical methodology: self-referential predication, self-negation and self-expression, or existential implication. Being itself has being, and in virtue of that self-predication, being itself must be being. The universal is self-negating. The universal being is no longer universal and stands in contradiction with itself. In virtue of negating itself, it expresses itself or particularizes itself as a being. The dialectical contradiction does not trivialize all truth or produce absolute indistinction, but produces a specific result. Dialectical logic shows how the contradiction endemic to the concept of absolute being has relative being as its specific outcome. And since the absolute must be relative in order to be absolute, the specific outcome of the dialectic is a self-modification of the absolute itself. Since the absolute cannot appear to philosophical reflection except as a contradiction, philosophy is charged with presenting the absolute as a contradiction. The absolute never appears as a purely consistent being. It only appears in a contradictory form, a form that has its origin in being itself. Thus, philosophy must not only present the absolute as a contradiction, but as a true contradiction. While dialetheism is the view that some contradictions are true, absolute dialetheism is the proclamation that the world exists, but with the qualification that the world exists is a true contradiction. Absolute dialetheism does not affirm that every contradiction is true. Rather, it states there are no consistent worldviews whatsoever. The absolute exists, and it exists in the form of contradiction. Although there are no consistent worldviews, there is no consensus about how to interpret this fact. On the traditional understanding of conceptual knowledge, there cannot be true contradictions. If the world is a true contradiction, then this truth must be a transconceptual truth. I've called this position mystical dialetheism. Mystical dialetheism is the position that the absolute is a true contradiction, but cannot be successfully articulated via concepts. And there is another species of absolute dialetheism, rational dialetheism. This is the conceptual form of absolute dialetheism, which holds that the absolute is intrinsically conceptual. For every variety, this position holds that the absolute is conceptual, and there are formal and non-formal varieties of this. According to the conceptual form of absolute dialetheism, the absolute can be successfully preserved and presented via concepts. How should we begin? Our preliminary reflections indicate that rational dialetheism is true, for we have demonstrated that the concept is absolute and self-realizing. And in my book, Hegel's Foundation for Metaphysics, I lay out these two possibilities, but I don't decide between them. I simply lay out the conceptual landscape. Okay, part 6, the limits of rational dialetheism. However, by thinking rational dialetheism through to its limit, we discover that by itself it cannot constitute absolute knowledge. Is there any limit to rational dialetheism? The absolute is self-relativizing. This means that it must determine itself to be relative. If the absolute really is a true contradiction and the concept is the absolute, then the absolute should be equally non-conceptual. It is one-sided only to emphasize the conceptual aspect of truth alone. To the contrary, on its own terms, that which transcends the concept ought to have an equal place in the formulation of absolute truth. In my own language, singularity itself demands the non-conceptual be given an equal place. The concept of the absolute is not relative to anything, and for this reason, it cannot be relative to relative being. Thus, the concept of the absolute must itself be relative. And since the concept of the absolute is relative and the relative is not absolute, the concept of the absolute is not absolute. The concept reveals that it is not sufficient to circumscribe the absolute and reveals that the concept of the absolute is divorced from the absolute itself. Conceptual knowing parts ways with the absolute itself. The self-realizing and absolute concept with which our inquiry began must be set to one side. A finite being amongst others, it is relativized, and as such, it is an insufficient reconstruction of the totality that exceeds it, to which it no longer corresponds. Since it is relative, and the relative is indebted to a principle of existence that exists outside it, the concept of the absolute is indebted to a principle of existence that transcends it. The concept of the absolute determines itself to have relative form and to appear in relative form. It must take on the very incompleteness that its very concept negates. Relative concepts such as mathematical and empirical notions have their principle of existence outside themselves. So too does the concept, I should say here, concept of the absolute. Qua absolute, the concept is its own principle of existence, but since it must determine itself to be relative, it must determine itself not to be its own principle of existence. And as relative, the concept of the absolute must depend upon a non-conceptual principle of existence in virtue of which it exists. As relative, without the external principle of existence, the concept as such, or the concept of the absolute, would not be. The absolute transcends all relative concepts exactly because it is not relative. However, since every absolute concept determines itself to be relative, and the absolute is that which is not relative, the absolute transcends all absolute concepts too. Thus, the absolute is that which transcends all concepts. The absolute is the trans-conceptual principle of existence in virtue of which any concept exists. And since the absolute concept as such must exist in virtue of something else, the principle of existence is not itself a concept. The particularization of the concept, its existence, has its origin in what is not a concept. As a result, the dialectics of the absolute concept demonstrate that the concept is not the sole element of truth. Conceptual thought impurifies itself, positing itself as one side, as the incomplete that exists at the whim of the transconceptual. The absolute must transcend every concept of the absolute, for every concept of the absolute must relativize itself. And as a result, the absolute must be that transconceptual principle of existence in virtue of which the concept of the absolute exists. Every concept is either relative or absolute, and since the latter relativizes itself, there cannot be any concept that is not relative. And as is evident, every concept depends upon the transconceptual for its existence. The transconceptual is absolute. Having raised the transconceptual to the throne of the absolute, we are finally able to understand, at least in one other sense, the singularity of the absolute. The absolute is completely unique, for there is only one absolute. As Rosenzweig teaches us, three alls are unthinkable. There is one and only one all, for nothing exceeds it. The absolute is totally non-repeatable, and as such, it is not universal, and it is totally unique. The absolute is the one and only singularity, and as such, it is totally transconceptual. Naturally, this is contradictory, for the singular always has the universal as its constituent. The self-referential power of the absolute concept nullifies its conceptuality and posits itself as transconceptual. For the one and only, unique, einzig, and absolute singularity, the conceptual exists in the form of the transconceptual. Notice the circle by which our thinking has proceeded. We began in medias res, from the relative position of conceptual cognition. We purified conceptual cognition of everything non-conceptual, having negated every concept that was merely relative, whose existence was relative to non-conceptuality. The absolute stood alone in its rarefied and absolute conceptual form. And having purified the concept particularized itself, thereby returning to the relativity from which our thinking began. But now the relative nature of the concept of the absolute is a result, not a beginning, and for this reason it is not a repetition of the same content, but a creation of something new. The dialectical return teaches us that the absolute concept, auto kath auto, is not the absolute. The absolute concept particularizes itself, but through its power of self-particularization, it renders itself relative and one-sided, thereby showing that it is indebted to a principle of existence that transcends the power of the concept. Our initial reflections in which we emphasized the conceptuality of the absolute were one-sided. In order to fully think through the dialethic absolute, we are called to consider the transconceptual principle upon which all conceptual thinking depends, even our own. The concept of the absolute is no longer absolute, for the rational form of absolute dialetheism shows itself to be incomplete and calls for an investigation into existence insofar as it transcends the concept. As Schelling teaches us, there is obviously something other and something more than mere reason in the world. Indeed, there is something which strives beyond these barriers, close quote. Okay, section 7, mystical dialetheism. Our investigation into the absolute began with the purification of everything and anything that might transcend the conceptual domain. With the self-negation of the absolute qua conceptual, we discovered that the absolute is totally purified of everything conceptual. It exists only insofar as it is transconceptual. And having purified thought of everything transconceptual, thought must again purify itself of this act of purification. Purification must be purified. Purity too must be self-referential. Thought must purify itself of all conceptual content, otherwise it cannot know existence as such. Because the absolute transcends the concept, so must our knowing of the absolute transcend the concept. Philosophy can only know the absolute if philosophy transforms itself into religion. Since the absolute exceeds all concepts, the practice by which the absolute is revealed must be a non-conceptual attentiveness to the absolute. And since such a consciousness does not draw any conceptual distinction, it does not draw a conceptual distinction between itself and the absolute. And this is nothing but mysticism, for mysticism is the non-conceptual experience of the absolute in which one is the absolute that one knows. As Nishida acutely observes, because such awareness is radically non-conceptual, and all contradiction requires the presence of a concept, religious consciousness no longer encounters any contradiction. Religious consciousness can resolve the problem of self-contradiction by ceasing to conceive altogether. Although the contradiction remains unresolved in thought, it is resolved by transcending thought. And this absolute consciousness is religious in the mystical or contemplative sense. By purifying our thinking of all mediating factors, we experience the absolute directly or immediately. But how is this mystical consciousness to be achieved? And what is its relationship with logic? Our reflections began from the self-negation, of a merely formal approach to the absolute and the affirmation of a dialectical logic of self-reference. Because this dialectical logic of self-reference already engenders the truth of some contradictions, namely the absolute itself, the mystical dialetheism developed here has its source in a logic of self-contradiction. The dialectical method operates by determinate negation in the sense developed by Hegel in the Phenomenology. According to this logic of self-reference, it's equally false that contradictions necessarily destroy all conceptual differentiations, or that they entail everything. Dialectical contradictions that are generated out of the dialectic of absolute thinking, have specific results. The self-negation of the absolute concept produces the relative absolute, and through its self-referential predication, the absolute concept negates itself and thereby determines itself to be the relative absolute. Being is an absolute concept, and as such, it is self-referential. The self-referential structure implies existential implication, and this existential implication further entails the concept is not absolute but relative. This is a contradiction, but from this contradiction, we do not infer that all distinctions collapse or that any proposition can be true. The relativity of the absolute is the specific negation of the absolute into which the absolute concept has transformed itself as the relative absolute. The self-negation of the concept of the absolute engenders a very specific content. The specific or determinate content of the relative absolute lies in the fact that it has its principle of existence outside itself. While the absolute exists in virtue of itself, the relative, the negation of the absolute, into which the concept of the absolute transforms itself, does not. By negating itself through the self-contradiction, the concept of the absolute determines itself to be relative, so that the concept of the absolute must have its existence outside itself. Thus, mystical dialetheism, which affirms this result and takes it as a starting point, belongs to a dialectical sequence of philosophical thought, for it is merely the consequence of the determinate self-negation engendered by the process of absolute thinking. The process of self-particularization not only initiates the self-realization of the concept, but it also spells its demise. By realizing and particularizing itself, it relativizes itself and thereby eliminates its absoluteness. By relativizing itself, it cancels itself and posits its negation as the absolute. The conceptual absolute negates itself and posits itself as relative, thereby raising its negation, the mystical absolute, to the throne of the absolute. For this reason, self-particularization is essential for the self-development of dialectical logic. In short, the dialectical logic out of which mysticism develops is not a formal system, for it is a self-differentiating system that operates as a source of its own content. However, because the absolute negates itself and posits itself in the form of the relative, the non-formal system of logic must determine itself to be a formal system. Thus, insofar as the concept of the absolute relativizes itself, it determines itself to be a merely formal concept. Exactly because the absolute exists in the form of self-contradiction, its self-contradictory form must contradict itself, thereby determining itself to be consistent. Thus, the self-relativization of the absolute is nothing less than an absolutization of the PNC, the specific result of the dialectical process, that is, the principle of non-contradiction. Qua a merely relative notion, the absolute is governed by the PNC, and ironically, the PNC can only be justified as an absolute principle of all reasoning by beginning from self-contradiction. Insofar as the concept of the absolute is governed by the PNC, it cannot admit its negation. However, the absolute can only be absolute if it is not other to what is relative, otherwise it would not be absolute. Thus, every categorization of the absolute leads to contradiction. Thus, relativization of the concept of the absolute precludes the truth of contradiction, and by doing so denies its claim to be absolute. By relativizing itself, the concept of the absolute negates its own claim to the absolute, and through the experience of the self-destruction of the concept of the absolute, the philosopher experiences the transconceptual as the absolute, the truth of which cannot be conceived or expressed by means of conceptual language. Rather than revise the structure of logic or continue the dialectical process within thought, mystical dialetheism follows the dialectical progression of the self-negation of the concept of the relative absolute into the dark night of transconceptuality. Through the self-relativizing of all concepts of the absolute, the philosopher fails to conceptualize it. And since the self-relativizing of the absolute is a form of self-contradiction in which the absolute is not itself, philosopher experiences opposing and mutually exclusive categories falling into a unity. The concept of the absolute relativizes itself, thereby losing its unconditioned status. And for this reason, all that is required for mystical experience is the experience of the self-falsification of the concept of the relative absolute, in virtue of which the philosopher can give witness to the absolute as that which is not conceptual. Since the self-contradiction of the absolute produces specific results, it denies the principle of explosion and Aristotle's principles that contradictions undermine all distinctions. However, by relativizing itself, it formalizes itself, and through that self-formalization, the PNC reasserts its dominion. So with the revenge of the PNC, no concept can live up to the absolute, for no concept of the absolute can maintain its independence from its negation. Thus, in the experience of the contradiction, the philosopher learns that the absolute transcends all conceptual distinctions. And since all conceptual distinctions are consistent, for they are governed now by the PNC, and the absolute contradiction in which the absolute is relative totally annihilates all conceptual distinctions, by conceptualizing the non-conceptual absolute, the thinker experiences a contradiction and thereby encounters total indistinction. We experience the absolute directly and immediately in the vanishing of categories into their negations. Ironically, the indistinction and contradiction that undermine meaning in Aristotle's polemic against contradiction is actually the root of its success as the path to absolute cognition. Since the absolute is that which is indistinct from nothing, it is non-other and relative to nothing, and the experience of contradiction is the experience of absolute indistinction. The indistinction of absolute contradiction is nothing less than the full revelation of the absolute itself. Falling into pure indistinction, the philosopher cannot find where they end and God begins. In the indistinction of contradiction, the philosopher celebrates the mystical absolute, the birth of Christ in the soul, the infinite personality. As Cusanus taught us, in the indistinction born from the violation of the PNC, there dwells the absolute. Exactly because the absolute transcends the structure of the formal concept, the mystical view affirms the contradiction as true. The contradiction is true, for it reveals all concepts to be relative and to exist in virtue of a transconceptual power. In mystical dialetheism, the truth of the contradiction lies in the way it reveals the absolute to be the other power, the power other to discursive reason in virtue of which any concept exists. The failure of the concept shows what cannot be said. Here, truth no longer operates as correspondence of concept with its object, but as transconceptual disclosure or aletheia. In mystical dialetheism, existence is that which stands out, and existence stands out as the thatness which resists our efforts to conceptualize it with any whatness. In mystical dialetheism, pure existence is immediately experienced in the ecstatic self-transcendence of categorical thought. Mystical dialetheism transcends the vision of existence proffered in rational dialetheism. If we characterize the concept as the mediated relation to an object, as Kant defined it, the overcoming of the conceptual relation of the object places the mystic in an immediate relation. Again, to cite Kant, the immediate relation is an intuition. Thus, in mystical dialetheism, the absolute is revealed in intuition, and since it is only by means of reason that there is the event, eragness of absolute revelation, the intuition is not sensuous but intellectual. In mystical knowing, being is revealed as existence only because discursive reason becomes an intellectual intuiting. Intellectual intuition is nothing other than what the Greeks called nous, the immediate contemplation of existence itself. Although mysticism can be irrational, there are many forms of that, mystical dialetheism is a form of rationalism, for it is nous by which totality is grasped. The truth that constitutes nous is the revelation of the absolute as contradiction. The mystical form of absolute dialetheism for which I am advocating here is born from a deeply intellectual and highly methodological engagement with totality. The method is totally exoteric and available to any and to all. Okay, section 8, philosophical religion. Mystical dialetheism appears to be one-sided. Given that the absolute cannot be successfully presented in concepts, science in general, Wissenschaft, appears to condition the appearance of the absolute. In order to be absolute, the absolute should also be successfully presented in scientific form. Given that here the transconceptual appears to exist by itself, how can the transconceptual self-correspondence of the absolute with itself ever engender a conceptual knowledge of the absolute? Since there is no true concept that corresponds with the transconceptual absolute, in the transconceptual experience of the absolute, one transcends all conceptual differences. But by transcending all concepts in the transconceptual experience of the absolute, one must also transcend the very transcending of concepts. More simply put, since all conceptual differences disappear in the transconceptual experience, there cannot be any conceptual difference between the concept and the absolute. Hence, in the transconceptual experience of the absolute, one experiences the indistinguishability of the concept from the non-conceptual absolute. Thus, the transconceptual knowledge of the absolute that constitutes mystical dialetheism cannot merely be the transconceptual self-correspondence of the absolute with itself, for the conceptual is indistinguishable from the transconceptual. Thus, the transconceptual knowledge of the absolute is a completely conceptual experience. In virtue of the transconceptual experience itself, one ought to recognize absolute truth as the self-correspondence of the concept with itself. Thus, in virtue of mystical dialetheism and the dialectic of the transconceptual thinking of the absolute cancels itself as purely transconceptual and is preserved in the rational form of absolute dialetheism. Because the transconceptual experience of the absolute transforms itself into an absolutely conceptual experience, one can know the absolute conceptually by matching the concept of self-contradiction in thought with the same concept of self-contradiction that is instantiated in the absolute itself. Mystical dialetheism perpetually failed to grasp the absolute consistently, and every attempt to think the absolute led to contradiction. Because every conception of absolute existence instantiates this contradiction, in each repetition of the concept of God, the mystic inadvertently demonstrates the pervasive and universal presence of the same concept of contradiction in absolute existence itself. Every concept of absolute existence always instantiates the same form, the form of contradiction. The truth of contradiction is what absolute existence shows itself to be. Since the absolute itself is contradictory, conceiving the absolute as contradictory is no longer a failure, but a success. For the contradictory character of being itself now corresponds to the conceptual contradiction advanced in philosophical speculation. The result of the process, rational dialetheism, is not just a reiteration of the beginning, for it now appears for the first time as the result of the self-negation of the mystical form of absolute dialetheism. The whole inquiry has formed a circle. Rational dialetheism negates itself, thereby giving rise to mystical dialetheism, whose self-negation transforms itself into rational dialetheism. The dialectical logic of the absolute progresses by moving through stages, from the rational to the mystical and back again. The circular return, the realized nostalgia, satiates the spirit. The logical process is not arbitrary. It is necessary and proceeds by way of specific stages, each predicated upon the previous moment. In the knowing of the absolute, there is a twofold process of dispersing from the one and gathering back into it. The concept empties itself, kenosis, of its conceptuality, only to return to it again, to its conceptual origin. Because each path leads to the other, should not the truth of the absolute be affirmed by taking both paths? As we have demonstrated, the absolute must be both conceptual and transconceptual, just as the constant must be both relative and absolute. The rational, conceptual, and mystical, non-conceptual forms of absolute dialetheism appear to be equally true. The absolute is both conceptual and non-conceptual in form. Philosophical religion connotes just this dialectic practice of knowing the absolute in its two-sidedness. Is this result not already implied from our earliest considerations? For if absolute knowledge is inherently self-contradictory, the knowledge that the absolute is conceptual should imply that the absolute is also non-conceptual and vice versa. Knowing that the absolute is transconceptual ought to imply that the absolute is conceptual too. To use Hegel's formulation, each moment of the whole concept is itself the whole concept. By contradicting itself, the self-contradictory absolute exhibits the form of self-reference. The self-contradictory absolute contradicts itself, and by contradicting itself, it remains itself. It maintains its self-contradictory form. Even by not contradicting itself, self-contradiction contradicts itself and thereby remains true to itself. In every relation to itself, it remains true to itself and remains what it is, inconsistent. By negating itself, it is true to itself, lives up to, and fully instantiates the categorical form of self-contradiction. Because the absolute is just as much transconceptual as it is conceptual, each form of absolute knowledge should give rise to the other. The mystical should transform itself into the rational and vice versa. And because philosophy begins in medias res, we could have begun from mystical dialetheism. Since rational dialetheism negates itself and posits itself as mystical, the mystical absolute would be the beginning and the end, and rational dialetheism a moment of the mystical absolute. In any case, this is true, but if we do not recognize the equal truth of its negation, then it is a one-sided truth. In every oscillation between the rational and the mystical, one and the same structure is realized in infinitely repeated self-contradiction. Philosophy is completed in the infinite self-repetition of the principle of self-contradiction. To quote Hegel here, contradiction is the rule of truth, non-contradiction, falsehood. Because the absolute is contradictory, it should be equally conceptual as much as it is transconceptual. In each case, one should be able to know that contradiction both conceptually as well as non-conceptually. And since conceptual knowledge of the absolute is only true to itself in the religious experience of the absolute in intellectual intuition, and the religious experience of the absolute is only true to itself in the conceptual knowledge of the absolute, true religion is philosophical and true philosophy is religious. Here again, Nishida is the pioneer. Philosophical religion consists in nothing other than thinking the absolute. In the intellectual intuition of the self-mediated conceptual relation, one is totally absorbed in absolute thinking. The experience of being absorbed means that one is totally lost in thought. And here there is no object that appears as the other to the subject that is thinking, only the absolute thinking is. And following Nishida's description of pure experience, philosophical religion is the pure experience of absolute thinking. Such a pure experience is a non-intuitive intuition. But being lost in the conceiving of the absolute concept itself, the self-contradiction intuitively appears as the one and all. For this reason, one can just as well speak of a non-reflective reflection. By intuiting the absolute in the experience of contradiction, in religious practice, I conceive the absolute contradiction, and in my act of conceiving the absolute contradiction, I intellectually intuit the presence of God. Absolute dialetheism calls for the self-contradictory self-identity of religion and philosophy. Absolute dialetheism has as its highest expression in the practice of philosophical religion. All right, chapter 9, the last part, the self-idealization of the absolute. What is the ontological significance of the return of rational dialetheism out of mystical dialetheism? Mystical dialetheism reveals the neither nor structure of the absolute, for in mystical knowing the absolute transcends all conceptual distinctions. And since the absolute is relative to nothing, it must exist in virtue of itself. As void of the conceptuality, it exists in the sense of Schelling's existence, pure thatness without whatness. However, since existence is singularity, and singularity always requires both the universal and the particular, in order to exist, the absolute must be conceptual. Thatness can only exist if there is the whatness of thatness. Thus, in order to exist, the absolute qua transconceptual must universalize itself. The absolute must undergo an autonomous process of self-conceptualization. How is it possible for the philosopher who operates with concepts to know this autonomous process of self-universalization? This seems especially difficult, for one cannot assume that the absolute is always already conceptual. The absolute must freely determine itself to be conceptual, so it cannot always already be that way. Likewise, it would appear that in order to know this process of absolute self-universalization, we cannot begin from a position of conceptual knowing. For the philosopher to know that process conceptually, the absolute ought to have already conceptualized itself. Indeed, we learned that the content of the absolute, which was relativized, can only exist in virtue of the transconceptual absolute. But how can this absolute, constituted as the neither nor, bestow conceptual existence upon the absolute? We know that the absolute exists. It has both conceptual and non-conceptual features. It is both universal and particular. And because the absolute is singular, we know that the absolute has universalized itself. It has made itself amenable to conceptualization by the philosophical mind. Indeed, this is what enabled our formulation of the ontological argument. Mystical dialetheism shows that the absolute is void of the concept. And moreover, given that the absolute exists and that it can only exist in virtue of itself, it must conceptualize itself. Since this is not only a transformation of our knowing, but also a transformation of the very being of the absolute, in the darkest night of the soul, where all conceptual distinctions vanish, we experience the self-conceptualization of the absolute itself. In virtue of intellectually intuiting being, the thinker witnesses the self-universalization of the absolute, in virtue of which the absolute itself exists. As Nishida points out, the absolute rationalizes itself such that there is the, quote, rationalization of what is absolutely irrational, close quote. When the thinker witnesses the end of mystical dialetheism, they immediately experience the self-actualization of the singular power of the absolute. In the experience of thinking the absolute, in the experience of the transition from pure intuition to pure conceptuality, in the transition from mystical to rational dialetheism, one gives witness to the self-singularizing power of the absolute, in virtue of which the absolute itself exists. What is the result? Since it is the transconceptual that has determined itself to be conceptual, the absolute exists as a unity of the transconceptual with the conceptual. The transconceptual exists as conceptual. Philosophical religion knows the absolute insofar as it exists, insofar as it is the one and only singularity. And because the absolute immediately conceptualizes itself, it negates its neither nor structure and posits itself in the form of the both and. It is both conceptual and transconceptual. It is the self-contradictory totality. Thus, the transition from mystical to rational dialetheism reaches teaches us that the absolute is self-idealizing. The absolute categorizes itself, and that self-idealization enables the absolute to be idealized by a conceptual and philosophical consciousness. We conceptualize the absolute, not because we resolve to, but we conceptualize it against our will. We are thrust into the conceptual nature of being out of our repose in the transconceptual, thereby learning that the absolute can and must exist scientifically. Hence, we can categorically affirm what initially appeared as a hypothetical truth, namely the conceptuality of the whole. At the outset, we argue that philosophy would be impossible without the absolute. With the self-idealizing of the absolute, the conceptuality of the world establishes itself by its own power, so that the hypothetical has become categorical. Hegel himself declares that knowledge of being qua being is a pure intuiting. The absolute beginning, whether it be epistemic or ontological, must be immediate, and that immediacy can only be known via an intellectual intuition. And because the absolute determines itself to be conceptually mediated, the absolute can be grasped by means of concepts. Thus, philosophers are no longer limited to the intellect alone, but can access the absolute by means of concepts too. It's the moment of mediation. Hegel says everything is immediate and mediated. Because rational dialetheism is true, the concept of self-contradiction that exists in the thought of the philosopher corresponds with the being of the absolute itself. Thus, the being of the absolute instantiates the concept of self-contradiction. Given that the absolute conceptualizes itself, the very transition from absolute indistinction to conceptual self-mediation is conceptually accessible and should have a conceptual articulation. We are now justified in conceptually describing exactly what transpires from the mystical to the rational, exactly because the absolute has determined itself to be conceptually mediated. Thus, we are emboldened to explicitly take up the position of rational dialetheism and describe the self-determination of the absolute from the standpoint of the absolute that is totally saturated in conceptual content. Thus, we are justified in our presentation of the absolute as a self-determining conceptual process. The ontological argument is hereby justified, and we return to the conceptual formulation of the absolute with which we began. Our articulation of the ontological argument generates a second conceptual series within the absolute itself, a second series of conceptualizations which corresponds with the first conceptual series in the absolute, a series that is generated by the absolute itself by itself. The transconceptual absolute makes itself vanish, and through canceling itself, the transconceptual absolute determines itself to be conceptual. The concept of the absolute achieves its truth, its correspondence with the absolute, in virtue of the transconceptual absolute canceling and preserving itself in conceptual form. By conceptualizing itself, the absolute determines itself to be both conceptual and non-conceptual. Absolute nothingness perfectly illustrates this self-contradiction, for the absolute instantiates no concept, and as such is absolutely nothing. By conceptualizing itself, absolute nothingness conceptualizes itself as the concept that is the absence of all concepts. And absolute nothingness to be is not to be. The absolute is absolute nothingness articulates the unity of being and non-being, the unity of the concept and its negation. As the Gospel of John teaches us, the absolute eternally determines itself to be the absolute logos. God is the logos, the absolute concept. The Christian tradition wisely identifies the logos with the second person of the Holy Trinity, the logos that is begotten from the Father, from the transconceptual absolute, with which it is identical. Given that a concept exists only on the condition that it is an instance of a concept, and the absolute must be an instance of itself, the absolute exists in virtue of itself. The absolute concept logos is the self-realizing possibility. In the night when all cows are black, in the absolute nothingness of mystical dialetheism, total indistinction reigns. And this is the unbounded contradiction in which the soul and the fly are all equals. But exactly because it is nothing, there is nothing that can stand against the dialectical logic, the logic that produces specific results by self-predication and existential implication. Thus, the unbounded contradiction of mystical dialetheism allows and enables the dialectical logic to be and to operate autonomously and absolutely. By looking into the depths of the unbounded and indistinct contradiction, one finds the restricted economy of dialectical logic. By operating absolutely, dialectical logic produces, via self-negation, the unbounded contradiction in which mystical dialetheism subsists. To be sure, the unbounded and indistinct contradiction endemic to mystical dialetheism itself appears as a specific result of absolute dialectical logic. It is itself an element of that dialectical logic. The unbounded or indeterminate contradiction of mystical dialetheism is canceled and preserved as an element within rational dialetheism itself, a logic of self-contradiction with a restricted economy and determinate order. Okay, conclusion. The age of the anthropos is the trans-anthropological age. It's the kairos of the theos, the theocene. Theocene marks a distinct metaphysical and theological epoch, an epoch in which the absolute first appears in the light of truth. And we philosophers are called to carry the torch of the absolute, to preserve that light whereby truth is revealed in every age. For too long, philosophers have labored under the illusion that singularity cannot be systematized, for every systematization would universalize what is not universal. We are reminded of Kierkegaard's objection that systematic thinking is always indifferent to the singular individual. But we have lived in fear of contradiction for too long, for the fear of contradiction implies a fear of absolute truth. The contradiction at the heart of singularity is not proof that the absolute exceeds the system, for the system is constituted by that very contradiction. Here the dream of Rosenzweig is realized. The system and singularity belong together in one system, neither compromising the other. The system is singular and the singular is systematic, for completeness can and is realized in the absolute contradiction. Absolute dialetheism is a one and only system of singular being. The thought is simple: no contradiction, no completeness. Abraham must turn his eye to the idol of the PNC, and the twilight of the idols must come to fruition. Twilight must turn to night. While Husserl originally inspired us to return to the things themselves, in the 21st century, we are called back to the conditions of all thinghood, the absolute. Back to the world itself, back to the absolute. Now and always, this is the demand and the rallying cry of speculative and dialectical thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. This is it's always an experience listening to you talk. It's a little bit like the Gymnasia in the Parmenides. So people are unused to such hardcore speculations nowadays, but it's always good to get back to it.
Yeah, I
So
apologize in advance for the depth of content, but I wanted to give just a sense of the form of the whole.
no,
So,
but the text helped. So the fact that we were able to read them along with you was already a a great thing. And mm, very well. So we will proceed as usual. So we can open the discussion. What we can do is, for those of you who are on Zoom, you can just raise your hand either in video or through the instrument. And for those of you who are on YouTube, you can just write your question in the chat, and I will read it to Greg. So we have Elena and Leonard. So Elena, please go on.
Yes. Sorry, I was cleaning my glasses. Thanks, Greg. This was amazing, truly exciting. I really enjoyed the second half of the paper where you tried to integrate mysticism in your absolute dialetheism. I think this was something maybe you expanded a little bit more compared to your previous book, and I really enjoyed it. Yeah. But my question doesn't concern this part. It's more on the first part, and it's maybe it relates to an issue that is not so central for you or what you're trying to do, but still, I go ahead and make it. So it concerns when you discuss the argument for the existence of the world, and you go through that, you go about that by speaking of self-differentiation of the absolute as self-instantiation, which does work and goes in the direction of the ontological argument, which I found very convincing. My issue with that is that maybe then it gets a little quick in the part of accounting for the world as a totality, so the need to have many different things. Because if you go about the existence of the absolute as the world through self-instantiation, then you only have being instantiated as a being, but then how do we have the many? So that would be my doubt or my question. If you could expand a little bit on that.
yeah, thanks so much. Actually, one of the problems and questions that I'm actually dealing with in the book is about the origin of empirical plurality. So not just origin of conceptual plurality. I mean, one might think that you have already being qua universal, you have being qua particular, you have being qua singular. So in some way you have plurality or many already, but it's very austere. It's an austere plurality because, of course, you don't have contradiction without many. Without many, you don't have contradiction. So even self-contradiction requires plurality, I think, at some level. You'll have relata that are inconsistent, and even if it's the self relating to itself, you'll need some kind of difference in order to have contradiction, right? So someone like Michael Della Rocca will not have contradiction because he has no many, he has no plurality, right? So, and he's one of the conversation partners in the book too. So let me say that I think if we accept that there's contradiction there, we see that we also already have plurality or manyness. But then the question is, the world that we're speaking about is not just this abstract world of conceptual maybe differences, but also the world of empirical order and empirical, right? Why this order of the world? Why this empirical ordering? And that question, I think, is actually very relevant for me, because one of the problems I don't discuss in this presentation, but is central actually in my critique of Hegel. I'll make some people upset at me for this. But I mean, I have a critique there that says that the concept as such, and actually it's a very Hegelian idea, so it's growing Hegel while critiquing him, so it's really a fake critique, is that the concept, you know, as Hegel himself says, can't account for Krug's pen. And Hegel himself says philosophy isn't, that's not our job. And he's right. But what it says is that there is a whole empirical ordering to the world for which the concept as such or the absolute can't be responsible. Or you can't at least deduce empirical plurality out of the absolute per se, right? The way that I did ontotheology. One can't do that, right? So then the question is what is it that makes possible the empirical differentiation? And it has to be, since it can't be the concept, it'll have to be the non-conceptual. And then you have the problem that it appears you have two principles. In order to have that empirical plurality, you have two principles. The concept that differentiates itself into absolute differences, and the non-conceptual accounting for the origin of empirical singularities and empirical kinds. That's why in the second part of the book, I try to show that when you think of the absolute as a transconceptual that conceptualizes itself, then you actually have one origin of difference, ultimately, because the transconceptual that is the origin of empirical difference turns out to have the same principle as the principle of absolute conceptual difference. So that's what I try to work out in the second half of the book. But I think that there is an empirical order that's purely contingent. That means you're not going to be able to read it out of the concept of the absolute. But if the absolute does conceptualize itself, then you should be able to give a reason for why it is at some level, even if you can't read it a priori out of the absolute, right? So I do try to give a reason for why there is an empirical order at all. And I think ultimately it's grounded in nothingness, that what is absolutely nothing can't be differentiated from anything. And so it can't be differentiated even from the empirical order of the world. And this is a kind of explanation for why there is an empirical order that doesn't have to, as it were, read out this specific order out of the absolute a priori. It says these are contingent forms, right? But these contingent forms are in fact grounded in the absolute as nothing. That's a long answer. That doesn't. It's probably way too much, but I'll send you the draft, and you can tell me if it makes any sense.
Thanks. Looking forward then
Yeah.
to read.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Elena. And so please, Leonard, go on.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for that. That was fascinating. I have two questions. So the first one is when you explain in the first part of the talk how Hegel understands singularity, you, I think, rightly emphasize that this is something that the concept must deliver. and that it's the sort of the formula for it is universality together in conjunction or in some form of collaboration, or however we want to flesh out these complicated relations with particularity. And I was wondering if you, so of course I fully agree that this is sort of the recipe Hegel gives us, and that somehow we're meant to see how these two moments working together somehow give rise to singularity, and that we're no longer just universal, but at the level of something singular. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how you think this working together between the two moments actually can be spelled out. And in particular, could you say a bit of how do you conceive of, how do you think of the moment of particularity? So you said at some point that it's no longer something universal, which sounds promising for the success of Hegel's model. However, I think a quite intuitive reading of it is to say, well, it's particular properties or something like some form of potentials or some, which quite clearly are repeatables, at least in my understanding. And that is precisely why I personally am more skeptical about the success of the collaboration between these two moments. So could you say a bit about that? And the second question is a really short one. When you mentioned the notion of pure thatness, you suggested that it must become universal, it must acquire a conceptual form. And I was wondering if you could say why you think that, because I believe, and I think Schelling believes that too, it doesn't have to. It could just remain eternally unproductive and refuse to take any specific form. But you seem to think differently about that. So these are my two questions.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, Leonard. It's good to see you virtually here. Better than not at all. Yeah, let me take each of these questions in turn. The first question is a really good question, and I guess I work it out more in my Hegel book. So I try to give a reconstruction of singularity on Hegel's own terms. So here you just heard me more or less giving you the shorthand, right? Very shorthand. So just taking up the notion of singularity out of Hegel as the unity of universal in particular, but definitely like in this presentation, also in the book that I'm writing, I don't spell out Hegel's kind of dialectical procedure in any detail. But let me just say a couple things about how I think about it. One, I think you're right, actually. Yeah, the particular is universal, and the particulars are universals. That's true. But they're also particular. So Hegel says the universal is universal, particular, singular. Particular is universal, singular, particular. Singular is universal, particular, singular. So I think you're right, but it's also particular. Now, by my they're repeatable and non-repeatable. That's what I think. So my view is that Hegel's logic of the concept is just inconsistent, and I think that's good. I don't think that's a problem. I just think that's how universality operates. So I just think that's how universality works. Now, how do I think about singularity in connection to universality and particularity? I tend to think of the universal as first, so it's self-differentiating or self-negating. So the particulars are, one could say, the universal in its self-alienated forms, right? And then you, in the domain of particularity, what you have are two particulars, universality and particularity. So you have universality and particularity, which are concepts, and they are particulars. They're particular concepts, right? So they are concepts, like you say, they're particular concepts, right? So then he has this bit about the illusory reference inward and illusory reference outward, right? So they have particularity in common, but they're each particulars. And in that respect, each as a non-repeatable instance, one could say what you have is the illusory reference outwards. You have the loss of universality. Insofar as each is just one in number, you have the loss of universality. So you simultaneously have the loss of universality, universality outside of itself, that's the loss of universality, but that is the universality of the particular, is that it's lost its universality, right? They're both particulars. And then I think of singularity as the return back into universality. this I think is pretty standard, that the particular, the universal in the form of self-negation negates itself, and this is the return. This is singularity, which is the return of the particular into the universal. But as a result, I think the result is just that every moment of the concept is the concept. So it ends up being both particular, it ends up being repeatable and non-repeatable. And now, yeah, I don't know. That's very quick. That's very quick. So I don't want to choose between the two. The second question, yeah, I disagree with Schelling. Strongly disagree with Schelling here. So I love Schelling. I love Schelling. I love the passion of Schelling, but I don't think so. I think part of the problem is this, is that, yeah, there's a kind of voluntarism here. The pure thatness could just remain distinct. This is pure existence that can just not do anything. But I think that if it really is indistinct, or is das reine Sein können or something, if it's this pure potentiality, that there's nothing about the conceptual, there's nothing about the non-conceptual that enables it to be distinct from the conceptual form of the world. So the point is that its complete void of conceptuality is exactly what makes it indistinct or unable to be different from conceptual form. That's the reason why you can't keep thatness separate from whatness. Basically, thatness is really inevitably that which enables whatness to be, and that it really seems can only exist in the form of whatness. Now, that may seem like what I'm saying is I'm taking Hegel's side, but I'm not exactly either, because I think in my book also there's a critique of Hegel. You may have heard that Schelling quote about there's also something other than reason in the world. And I think it's very important that we see that Hegel says somewhere that that truth has the form of the concept alone. And this is something I'm very much disagreeing with. My view is not that, like Hegel thinks, the non-conceptual only exists in the form of the concept. But I also want to take the inverse, and I want to say the concept as such exists in the form of the non-conceptual. And then that's equally the case. So yeah, thanks so much for the questions.
Thank you, Leonard. Sorry, I was reading through the YouTube video some passages. And thanks, Greg, for the references. Are there any other questions? Because if there aren't, then I have a couple, but yeah, well, I will then ask a question, Greg, if it's okay for you.
Yes, of course.
So, I was wondering, I have a couple of questions. Maybe they're more clarificatory than actual remarks. Your concept of existence is something that, because I was trying and go back to your paper, but maybe you can help me there. So
Yeah.
you say that in order for something to exist, it must instantiate a universal, but you're not saying, so to say, that that's all it is, right? So the definition of existence is not something that instantiates a universal. It's something that exists, right?
Yeah, it's at least that. Yeah.
It's at least that.
I'm open to it being to being more. Yes.
Sorry?
Yeah. So I'm open to it being more.
No, because I mean the problem. So the easy way of doing this is, can you make me an example of something that does not exist?
Yes. That's so if I say, yeah, that this is going to be difficult, and anything that I say will have to exist somehow, right? So I could say that, right? So this is it, is that I say that there is no unicorn in my room here, right? So there's somehow no unicorn here. I have a concept. It doesn't correspond with anything here, but of course it somehow does exist somehow, maybe as a possibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't exist in my office.
Yeah, because I mean that's what is very interesting, and I mean this is I'm familiar with this strategy from other philosophers, especially. I mean, I know I mention him every time, but there's this guy in Italy, Emanuele Severino,
Yes,
who
yes.
has precisely this argument. So I mean, it is not nothing. That's always his response. So and it was very similar to the counterexample you gave and to the argument you were building at the beginning of your paper when you said if I try and so to say counter argument for something that does not instantiate the universal, it will at least instantiate the universal of non-existing or the universal of negation. So it won't be nothing, so to say. But what I find interesting is that in a way, it is a very, very general
Yes.
uh,
It's very,
concept of existence.
yeah.
And I mean, it is, so to say, it makes, it creates, so to say, a problem because, I mean, it's, once you remark that, once you point out that your notion of existence is very I want to say abstract, but it's not like not in the sense of not in the Hegelian sense. It is very so to say it's very minimal, so to say, so to say. Then the metaphysical element, so the counterintuitive element of your system becomes much less counterintuitive, so to say. So becomes much more acceptable in a way. Because I mean, I will be more than willing to accept that since I mentioned the unicorn, then the unicorn is not nothing. And in a way, I mean, in some way, it's not nothing. But then we come back to the problem, and maybe somehow what also Elena was asking, namely how you go from this kind of existence to something like what you call empirical existence, or what I would call nature, so to say. Because I mean that's then the issue. So the issue is, I mean, the danger is that through this word existence, you let something pass that you're not actually meaning, because it's much more general at the beginning of your paper. And then in the second part of your paper, when you need actually a stronger sense of existence, you have this stronger sense because you let it pass, so to say, under the radar at the beginning of your paper. I don't know whether I make myself clear, so to say.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, so why do you think I need a stronger sense of existence in the
No,
second?
I don't think you do. I don't think you need a
Okay.
stronger sense. But I'm under the impression, and maybe I'm wrong, that in the second part of your paper, you want a stronger sense of existence. That is, you want to account for something. I mean, if I talk about the empirical unicorn, and if I talk about the empirical, I don't know, the box of marmalade in front of my table. Of course, we can agree this is an empirical concept in your vocabulary because it is something I derive from experience. But so one thing is if you want to say that that is an empirical concept. Another thing is if you want to say that somehow from the referential self-dividing of the concept, you can come to the existence, to the empirical existence of the box of marmalade. So one thing is, so to say, maybe in a formula it could be,
Yeah.
one thing is the empirical existence of the concept, and one other thing is the existence of an empirical concept.
Yes.
It's two different things. I wonder what you think about that.
So I actually think that so there's the existence of the empirical concept, and what's the other one? I'm just
So the existence of the empirical concept,
yes,
which makes no problem, which makes it's no issue, and then the empirical existence of the concept, meaning that
yes,
you
yes,
then
yes. Good.
meaning something else when you say that something exists, so to say.
Yes. So I actually think both are contingent. So
Mhm.
both could not have, both could be otherwise. So if you have some empirical concept that exists, it's perfectly possible that it never existed or that it doesn't exist. And then the empirical existence of the concept, this is also contingent. So there's no pretense that these will be deduced from some kind of self, from out of the absolute in some kind of dialectical manner. I think this is actually another source of there's another line of attack against rational dialetheism that I didn't present here, which is this question of what is the origin of the empirical division of conceptually divided, you could say, what is the origin of the differentiations amongst empirical concepts? And that would also then, by my own lights, be connected to the origin of the very fact of empirical differences as they exist, right? So I think this is all totally contingent. But
my problem is because, sorry, no, please go.
Yeah, no, so it's okay.
No, I just want to say, I understand what you say about contingency. It was not precisely my point, so I don't want to be, as say, Krug 2.0. I don't want to say, I didn't want to say, how can you deduce the existence of the box of marmalade? My point is, how can you account for what you're meaning when you're saying that the box of marmalade exists as a box of marmalade? Because, I mean, just now you said the existence of the box of marmalade is contingent. And which implies that you can, in a way, wonder. You can at least imagine that it doesn't exist, which you cannot do because you just said no. Because, I mean, in the moment you try and imagine the box of marmalade non-existing, you're already instantiating it.
Yeah. So absolutely non-existing. So the question is, though, there's a difference between absolute non-existence and relative non-existence, right? And right. So I think that distinction is very important to keep in mind, right? So, like, if somebody asks me, so I think also another concept that's important for the discussion is truth. And I haven't, again, that's another chapter in the book. It's something I didn't speak of. But if you think about truth as the correspondence of concept with the object, right? We're thinking about empirical truths, asking whether there's a box of marmalade on the table or not. And I say, well, by appeal to experience, I look and see it's not there, right? So I try to find the concept. So I have it. And then I try to find the object. I don't find it on the table. And so I say it's false that there is a box of marmalade on the table. That is to say that the box of marmalade does not exist in this, to use Marcus Gabriel's terminology, this field of sense, right? But it doesn't mean that, right? So it doesn't exist in that way. It may exist as a possibility, but it doesn't exist here in this way. And then when I ask, does the empirical concept exist? What I'm doing is I'm thinking about an empirical concept and asking whether the concept that I have, the concept of the empirical concept, corresponds with that. And then I can find it and I can say, oh, yes, my concept of the empirical concept corresponds with the empirical concept. There is such an empirical concept. And my concept of it corresponds with it, right? And so that's, of course, a similar operation. But in the one case, I have a concept as the object. In another case, I have the instance of a concept as the object, right? But the denial of it existing in one way doesn't mean that it doesn't exist at all.
Of
that's
course.
what but this is I need to think more about how robust the notion of existence needs to be. So it's a good question. It's a good point. Whether it's enough.
May I ask?
Yes.
May I ask? Do you at all work on David Lewis's philosophy?
No, no.
Because I mean, you could find him very interesting. Because I mean, he has a very strong. Because what you're saying right now, I mean, David Lewis has this idea which I find very interesting, but I'm strongly against it. But it's still interesting that, so to say, possibility is existence in another world.
Oh yeah.
So but I mean, what maybe would be interesting for you is this idea that, so to say, existence has a very different meaning than usual. So because my question was basically that. I mean, I think I was wondering whether, so you for instance, you differentiated between relative and absolute existence, and I was under the impression, but maybe I was wrong, because I mean it was very thick, it was very rich, your talk, that you somehow wanted to deduce not singular empirical existing things, but at least that kind of existence that we usually mean when we talk about, so to say, empirical existence. So the idea, so there is a stronger notion of existence with respect to what we've just been discussing.
Yeah. So yeah, that stronger sense, I don't want to give any privilege at all to the empirical whatsoever. And in
Yeah,
fact, it has there's no privileging, and it's yeah. So I don't think that's what I want to do.
yeah,
But I'll
yeah,
think
yeah.
more about it. I'll think more
I
about it.
will have to read.
Yeah,
I will read the
yeah.
book. I mean, that these are just
It's
questions.
very
Is
it's
there
it's
any other question?
significant
So
Meinomian directions, and there's maybe reading a bit too much Priest and Gabriel on this, where my notion of non-existence as existing elsewhere seems to be very close to this. And yeah, I'll have to think more about it. Yeah, thanks.
yeah. No, but thank you. Absolutely. Are there any other remarks, questions? Because if not, I have a last question as well.
Okay.
But if nobody has a question, no, Leonard, please go on.
Yeah, maybe if I may, just a quick follow-up on our earlier discussion.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I was in relation to the second issue of whatever exists is sort of bound to acquire at least conceptual form. So I can see how that works from a Hegelian standpoint, where you believe in the unity of being and thought as being something like a sort of unsurpassable, I don't want to say presupposition, but even Hegel at times calls it something that is überall vorausgesetzt. So you could read Hegel at least as saying that this is some sort of like bedrock where it just makes no point to ask further questions. Why is there unity of being and thought? And then of course this sort of like charm of or problem of Schelling's approach is to say, oh well, I'll ask that question. I'll ask how did the world end up in the nets of reason, and I have tons of other cool ways of putting the same point. And then, of course, I mean, I don't have an argument on my fingertips why that sort of question is legitimate, but I also think that sort of for Hegel, it's not crystal clear why you shouldn't be worried about that, why you shouldn't wonder, are there any conditions for the establishment of something like the unity of being thought? Yeah, maybe that just as a comment, sort of without solving anything, sort of just.
Yeah. No. So I think Hegel's phenomenology is supposed to be an answer to that. So I think, well, that's one way of reading it, right? You suppose that thinking and its object are distinct, right? And then you run the phenomenology, and then you find out that this distinction between thinking and being can't be maintained. And so then you begin with a logic which begins with the collapsing of that distinction, right? Where what you have is the indistinction between, say, the conceptual and being. So he says it's pure truth, realm of pure truth, right? So I think that's maybe one way that, maybe a Hegelian might try to argue that Hegel does think he can give you also, as he talks about like phenomenology of spirit as the science. It's a preparation for science. So it's somehow supposed to prepare you for the science. It has to be scientific and a preparation. So this is also, we have to address this apparent problem that it's both. But I think that's what he wants to do. And whether it's successful is another question, I think, altogether. But I've always worried about it. Like I've always worried about whether the world in general has conceptual form. Like that's been mostly what I've been thinking about is the world conceptually mediated? Because I think that's what it needs to be in order to know it. So that's why this book I'm writing is all about that question. And I think it's a lot more difficult than people think. Like it's really one of the hardest things to think about is, what does the world need to be like in order for it to be knowable? And we don't want to fool ourselves into thinking that, it's rational when it isn't, just so we have the convenience of science. So, that's always been my worry is the world rational? That's mostly, is it conceptually mediated? And that's mostly what I've been thinking about for decades. That's why I never made it to ethics.
Yeah, I mean, right. The phenomenology is is meant to sort of guide us and make us recognize that that the world actually is rationally mediated, as you put it. But you could have a further question, even if it is so mediated, why? And I think that's the sort of thing where I believe that Hegel would just say, "Oh, come off it. This is no
Yep.
longer a good question. Just leave it." Whereas that seems to be where people like Schelling or Heidegger and so on get started, where they say, "Oh no, this is precisely what we should worry about." And I'm not taking a side in the thorny issue whether that is a legitimate question to ask or not. I'm just saying they might say, yes, phenomenology, lovely, it proves what is factually the case. But we ask why.
Yeah, so I mean, I am sympathetic with the worry. I mean, that's why you'll see some of the Nishida citations that the irrational. I think I had these citations about Nishida arguing that the irrational rationalizes itself, or the irrational transforms itself into rational form. Right? So that was an important part of the argument here. And I think this is something arguably left out in the Hegelian story, that he's placed, to use Brooks' terminology, he's got a one-sided inner subsumption, where he's got the non-conceptual in the conceptual. But what we need to show is first, we need to show how the conceptual is in the non-conceptual. And not only that, but how it is that the conceptual arises out of the non-conceptual. Why is the world in the chains of reason? And we can't begin from reason to show that. That's what I tried to show at the very end of the paper, is that exactly because the absolute is beyond the concept, because it is transrational, because it is the night when all cows are black, because it is the absolute void of nothingness, it must rationalize itself. It must conceive itself. It must determine itself to be conceptual. This is what I call self-universalization. So I am really sympathetic with the worry, the concern. I just think that what I'll think of it as the fetishism of finitude that you see in the late Schelling and in Heidegger and in all the French thinkers, Derrida, Levinas, this fetishism of finitude is really just a lie. And it's just a huge stumbling block to knowing. And I think it's the most popular position. People talk as though it's some radical thing, but it's the most conservative thing to be a philosopher of finitude and difference. This is the most conservative thing I think that you could assert today, especially in European philosophy. And I think it also has the downside of just being false. Now, I know that's very strong what I just said, but I'm sympathetic with the worry. I'm really sympathetic with the worry. I just think that there is that the irrational ground of reason rationalizes itself. And maybe that's a kind of rational optimism where I want to acknowledge their worry, but say that the unreason overcomes itself. And I have a long preface where I don't know if I've been too polemical against the fetishizers of finitude, but a lot of people find themselves subject to Abraham's hammer in the idol shop. So Abraham is smashing a lot of idols in the idol shop.
We love you being radical. There is Brooke, I think, who has a question. So,
okay.
Yeah, if we do have time, because what Greg just said was sort of along the lines of what I was also thinking, but I want to maybe connect this to Elena's original question and sort of push this if we have time for this. Because I was going to say exactly what you just said. In other words, I think you do have kind of an answer, which is that self-universalization is inevitable, is unavoidable just precisely in escaping the universal, right? So you don't need an origin outside of contingency itself. You can just, you either have contingency or not contingency, and if you do have contingency, it will universalize. And if you don't have it, then you will have universality already. And here's my question, this follow-up question. I think there's a very quick step, and I think it's in the book too. Obviously, we will have this conversation at length at another time, but just because I think it is relevant to this, basically, my question is what the conception of order is when you said, or organization is when you say the world is a single organized totality. And I think the step there, as it's presented, was simply that the world that it is unified by universal concepts. I don't know, and then you will fold in this sort of self-alienation into the principle of non-contradiction as a sort of further entailment of that. But I guess what I'm thinking is, does that exclude the possibility that we have, maybe somewhat in line with Alessandro's invocation of the David Lewis idea, we will have non-contradiction and organization and universalization emerging from contingent particulars, each of which is internally consistent. And there is a kind of, obviously, a relation between those systems of internal consistency. But does that sort of meta order itself have to be the non-contradiction order? Or can your notion of organization already fold in the self-contradiction, which is according to you, the idea, the very nature of the absolute? So what you would have is sort of infinite worlds. They don't have to be elsewhere. Obviously, what I'm thinking is, you say there's no unicorn there. What do you do if there's another guy in the room who's a schizophrenic, let's say, who says, what are you talking about? There's a unicorn right there. Do you still have any reason to adjudicate between those two on empirical grounds? Or I guess I'm suggesting, maybe do you need to go all the way around the horn, as it were, and embrace this alternate, because he will have his own universalization going on. And there will be points where those two might be able to interface or integrate or do the same kind of operation you're doing between the conceptual and the non-conceptual, this Mobius strip reversal into each other. But you could only get there by leaning in on either side. So we'd have to really modify the notion of a single ordered cosmos. You could still say that, but it would be in a self-contradictory way.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brooke. We're back to the schizophrenic again.
Yeah.
Always back. Yeah, thanks so much for the question. The single order, I guess, and as you know, one of my worries is trivialism. So I'm really motivated to avoid the view that every proposition is true. And I think that what I mean by an ordered world is just that there are just falsehoods. Some things are false, some propositions are false. And so take the example of say I have a friend over I have a lot of parties on my roof. And my friends, maybe they're not, they've just had a lot to drink and they're insisting that there's a unicorn. And I would, I think it's a defeasible claim for me to say that there isn't one, and also defeasible for them. There's no certainty in it, but I would say it's simply false. And that there's evidence maybe that one could appeal to. And my friend could also appeal to evidence as well, and we would have a debate about it. And the reason that we have a debate about it is because we hold that, well, it either is the case or it's not. So my commitment to there being order means that trivialism is not true. So it's also connected to my denial of the principle of exclusion. And so that's the kind of just a basic commitment. And I know that you and I may diverge there. Part of the order of the world here is also part of the order of the logic, I think, that rational dialetheism engenders mystical dialetheism, and the self-negation of mystical dialetheism engenders rational dialetheism. And that there is one could say a necessity in the dialectical progression from one to the other that operates in a very specific way. Such that there's a transition that has a very specific way that it operates, that isn't just equally exchangeable with any other transition, right? So this is, I know, very minimal. This is very minimal order, right? It's not saying this empirical ordering of the world must be, and it's impossible that this empirical order of things is the only way that it could be. I'm definitely not saying this. And I really, actually, I fully agree that the notion of self-development is, I mean, by my lights, the fact that there's nature at all, the fact that there's any matter, the fact that there's time and space are all contingent. But they're in a way self-externalizations of absolute nothingness. They're self-externalities of absolute nothingness, which then have their own, because they have their own histories. That is to say, evolution, right? The development of consciousness. And through one can tell a whole story about how self-contradiction so operates. We have the absolute, it's free and self-determining. It determines itself to be the opposite of free, to be mechanical. The mechanical determines itself to be unmechanical, to be teleological. The teleological aspect of life, which isn't conscious, contradicts itself, determines itself to be living self-aware life. Living self-aware life contradicts itself, posits itself as conceptually self-aware life, contradicts itself, posits itself to be a philosopher who grasps the whole thing. So I think the order of self-contradiction, the power of, I even talk about self-contradiction as principles of sufficient reason, is really what you need to appeal to solve a lot of problems. Why is there consciousness if you begin from unconscious premises? If you have true contradictions, you have the power of self-contradiction, you can explain these things in principle. But I definitely don't want to deny a fundamental contingency in the ordering of things. But I definitely want to say some possibilities are just false. So I don't know. I think this is going to be a longer conversation between us.
Right.
I think.
Okay.
Well, we are keeping it going, so to say. So this is what the seminar is for.
Right.
Well, I will just say, Greg, thank you so much. This was a beautiful discussion, and thank you all for being with us. I'd say we can meet again next month. We have June 26 and 27 with Jakub Macha and Andrew Lazzella. So we are still keeping going. And for now, thanks, Greg. Thanks, you all. We will meet again very, very soon.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Alana. Thanks, Brooke. Thanks, Leonard.
Bye.
All right. Bye. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.